Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of Why Mind. We will start our first conference of this morning. Our speaker is Professor Bruce Cuthbert from National Institute of Mental Health. And the conference is Toward the Future of Psychiatric Diagnosis, the NIMH Research Domain Criteria Project. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Good morning. It is really a pleasure for me to be here and an honor to be asked to this revolutionary conference in Brazil, and I would like to thank my friend Jair Maier for inviting me. I say friend even though I have only met him on one other occasion, but for those of you who do not yet know him very well, just after one meeting you feel as though he is your friend. He is that kind of warm gentleman. So it's really a splendid conference that he has put on. So this morning I want to talk about a new project that we are undertaking at NIMH, and this is a very complex project, so I just want to really dive in. But as you can see, this is about trying to change the way we do psychiatric diagnosis. And let me just start with a paper. So many of you might wonder, why are we thinking about a new research classification system for psychiatry when we have a new DSM-5 just coming out in a couple months? The ICD revisions are underway. So I think this is a good place to start, because this is actually an article by Daryl Regier and David Kupfer, who are the two leaders of the DSM-5 revisions. And as they concluded in a recent paper, as we gradually build on our knowledge of mental disorders, we begin bridging the gap between what lies behind us, presumed etiologies based on phenomenology, and what we hope lies ahead, identifiable pathophysiologic etiologies. So what our project is really about is this second part of moving towards true pathophysiology and etiology. So what does that mean exactly? Well, our current psychopathology diagnostic systems really are based on a shared understanding in Western culture that stems back some 2,000 years, at least speaking with respect to depression, which of course to the ancient Greeks was known as melancholia. And so we've really sort of carried that notion down to the present time. More recently, the notable German psychiatrists like Kraepelin and Bleuler defined psychotic disorders and made the classic Kraepelinian distinction between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Obviously, there was nothing known about the brain, genes, or anything at the time that these sorts of ideas were created, and so we necessarily had to define disorders in terms of the presenting signs and symptoms. And this was very useful when there was so little scientific knowledge, and a lot of practical and useful information was gained about the course of the disorder's outcome and so forth. However, as we moved into the modern age of neuroscience and genetics and behavioral science over the last 30 years, increasingly we see that these data simply do not map well onto our mental disorders. There are a lot of problems, and I've listed some of them briefly here. First, we know that our disorders are very heterogeneous. The way the disorders are described makes it sound as though every patient with a given diagnosis has exactly the same thing wrong with them, but in fact that is certainly not true. There are many different mechanisms involved in any one of our disorders. Another problem is that if you look at any one mechanism, such as fear or memory problems or impulse control, those sorts of problems are observed in multiple disorders. And so it's really hard to know exactly whether you're talking about exactly the same sort of thing in one disorder versus another, like impulsivity or working memory. Another problem is extensive comorbidity. When you have someone who gets diagnosed with 2, 3, 4, 5 disorders, you start to wonder if these can really be that many different disease entities, as though you had cancer and heart disease and arthritis and gout or something. But rather you wonder if you're not missing something more fundamental that is responsible for all of those observed diagnoses. And finally, we've had a tendency in the field to reify our disorders. That is, to take some abstract idea like depression, which is really only simply a name for a collection of symptoms, and then reify it as though that actually is a real disease process, and then we start to make causative statements that, well, because you're depressed, you have such and such change in your brain, as though depression as a concept is now some actual agent causing these changes rather than simply being a name for observed data. And so although we have many good things with our diagnostic system, it has promoted reliability and standards across the field, we see increasingly that as modern science tries to bring its weight to bear on our problems, we're not doing so well. And yet our system completely dominates the entire research enterprise, because if you want to get a research grant, the standard way to come in is with a DSM disorder, usually versus controls. And you look at animal models of disorders to try to get a hint of etiology, and then you do an early etiological study in humans, an early trial, a late trial, and you go to the regulatory agencies like our Food and Drug Administration in the US, all in terms of these disorders, because that's really the only way you can get an approved indication for a new drug. And behavior therapies typically follow the same pattern to show validity. So the problems are well illustrated in just a couple of quotes. First, with respect to the heterogeneity of disorders, last year there was a notable publication about the first study of schizophrenia patients with induced pluripotent stem cells by Fred Gage's lab. And this got a lot of press, deservedly so, because it's an exciting new methodology, and they found 400 or more disrupted genes in these sorts of preparations of cells induced to become neurons in the culture, in a culture dish. But the famous Welsh psychiatrist Michael Owen commented, well, yeah, this is good, but you have to bear in mind that every one of these patients has really a distinct disorder. And he went on to say, these disorders are not really disorders. There is no such thing as schizophrenia. It's a syndrome. It's a collection of things psychiatrists have grouped together. So this is the kind of problem with our current diagnostic system that we think we need to address. And here's another perspective for scientists at a pharmaceutical company, the drug hunter's perspective, and they state, on average, a marketed psychiatric drug is efficacious in approximately half of the patients who take it. One reason for this low response rate is the artificial grouping of heterogeneous syndromes with different pathophysiological mechanisms into one disorder. So clearly, we recognize the problem both in terms of etiology and in terms of treatment. So this is a slide I borrowed from Dr. Insel. It was written about early psychosis, but could apply to any of our disorders. Here we are now, and where would we like to be in 10 or 15 years? Well, and this is especially relevant, I think, for the prevention research theme of this workshop and conference. We only diagnose by symptoms now, as I've said, so that means you really have to wait until somebody is showing some fairly overt symptoms for the most part to try to get them entered into treatment. And we tend to treat an episode. Someone has a psychotic episode, a depressive episode. We may have to bring them to the hospital. We may have to see them for treatment. We kind of put some Band-Aids on that manage the condition, send them back out, and then they reappear again, and we do it all over again. Where would we like to be? We would like to be at the place where we actually can talk about real strategic prevention, that we are able to stop the onset of these disorders. I think that when you read lots of literatures, it's always presumed that mental disorders will always be with us and that it will always be about the same problem that it is now. But if you look at other areas of medicine, deaths from heart disease have dropped dramatically over the last 20 years due to modern prevention and curative interventions. In childhood leukemia, 30 years ago, the death rate from childhood leukemia was about 95%. Now the death rate is only 5%. But we haven't really changed our numbers at all in our disorders. We still show the same prevalence, morbidity, and indeed mortality as these disorders have been for a long time. This is not acceptable, and this is where we need to be going to get to actually preventing these disorders and realistically talking about recovery and cure. And we think that it's realistic to do so, but only if we really change how we go at things. And what that's going to involve in large measure is to really understand the pathophysiology in a much more detailed way, not of the DSM heterogeneous syndromes, but in terms of specific disease mechanisms that can then get us to where we actually can talk about biodiagnostics, if you will, effective biomarkers for a specific aspect of problem, and really treating core pathologies rather than the overt symptoms. And by this more specific avenue, we can go on towards personalized care, and this is part of what's been called personalized medicine, in the directions that we need to go. But clearly, this is not simply a matter of genes and cells. We also need to understand neural systems and how they interact with our social environment and the world. So in the future, what do we want it to look like? We really want to have diagnosis and therefore treatments, both preventive treatments and treatments for a disorder when it does appear, that are actually based upon all of the brain science that we have and will be accumulating in the future: genetics, neural circuits, and behavioral science. But the paradox is that we will never get these kind of approaches to diagnosis and thus to treatment development that are based on neural circuits until we have a research literature that it can tell us how we ought to do that. It's not at all clear at the present time how you would make that kind of system or what you would need to know exactly. But we'll never have that kind of literature as long as research is conducted with our current diagnostic systems rather than in line with our accelerating knowledge of brain neurobiology and functioning. So as I said at the outset, now almost all of the research grants come in terms of 1 DSM disorders versus controls. Over 90% of the publications are published that way, disorder X versus controls. And we're never going to get to where we need to be unless we start doing research in a different way. So that's what the NIMH has decided that we have to do. It's very difficult and very hard, and we don't know exactly how this should work, but we know that if we don't start now, we keep deferring the future and the gains that we need to make indefinitely. So the new classification system that has been termed the Research Domain Criteria Project, or RDoC, is stated in Goal 1.4 of the NIMH Strategic Plan: to develop, for research purposes, new ways of classifying mental disorders based on dimensions of observable behavior and neurobiological measures. Now, I want to underscore dimensions and the fact that we see both behavior and neurobiological measures here. This is not a reductionistic approach. Rather, it's something that honors the fact that we're actually talking about impairments in behavior in different ways: emotional behavior with others, cognitive behavior like working memory, ability to interact appropriately with your world, and so forth. So there are 4 parts to implementing this goal. First, to actually identify the fundamental components, that is, these dimensions, that span multiple disorders, such as executive function or affect regulation. And what this meant is that we actually held a series of workshops with experts to try to help us determine what those fundamental dimensional components are. Second, it determined the full range of variation from normal to abnormal. This is a very significant statement. Part of the problem in diagnosis to date has been that we really had no idea of what normal was. We tried to define abnormality in the complete absence or near complete absence of having any notion of what normal brain operations and behavioral functions look like. But part of the research over the last 30 years has not only told us a lot about mental disorders, it's told us as much and more about the normal brain circuits that implement normal behavioral functions and how that works. And so we can increasingly think about, realistically, understanding abnormal behavior in the ways that it deviates and the mechanisms involved that you go from normal behavior to abnormal behavior. Third, we want to integrate across a number of different ways of measuring these components, including how people report their experience. And finally, because these are new ideas and new dimensional components in many cases, we need to develop reliable and valid measures of these fundamental components that we can use both in basic studies to look at the normal variation and in clinical studies, in etiology studies and clinical trials, and perhaps down the road for actual clinical use. This is the RDoC work group. These people have been drawn from all areas of the Institute, and I'm privileged to lead this project, but indeed all of this group have made very significant contributions. It's been truly a team effort, and I want to acknowledge their hard work. So this is an idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about moving away from a DSM diagnosis towards brain circuits. This is a well-known paper from Andreas Meyer-Lindenberg and Danny Weinberger, both then at NIMH. And just as an example, up here you see the canonical working memory circuit through the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, and the thalamus, and we know something about the genes that affect this circuit. Here you see some of the limbic circuits related in both reward-related processes in the mesolimbic dopamine system, and emotional regulation through medial prefrontal cortex, and we know something about the genes there. And to take just psychotic disorders for one, we like to think of affective psychosis as things that presumably go wrong here, and non-affective psychosis as things that happen here. But in fact, as the cartoon shows, you see a lot of overlap. People with depression have problems in working memory and episodic memory, and people with schizophrenia certainly have been shown to have lots of emotional regulation and reward-related problems. So these are circuits that cut across our disorders, and so the notion is this is really the focus of study that we need to have, circuits like these and the functions that they implement. So this is the actual RDoC matrix. This is the final version after a series of 5 conferences that we held over a couple years, the last one being last summer. First, I want you to look at the left-hand column here. In the boldface, we have 5 major domains of functioning, thus the research domain criteria project. First is negative valence systems, that is to say systems that mediate aversively related behavior like fear, stress, and so forth. Positive valence systems, reward and so forth, cognitive systems, systems for social processes, and arousal and modulatory systems. We had one workshop with 40 experts in the field from a wide variety of disciplines who came in to talk about each domain in turn. We nominated as our working group a few initial constructs, and you can think of these as these sort of dimensional constructs, for the group to consider, and then they took those under advisement and in the course of the workshop decided on what they thought this list should look like. And so they decided on what the actual constructs would be in that domain, made a definition of each construct and elaborated a little bit how one construct differed from another, and then, as I'll show you in a moment, actually identified some of the measures in each of these units of analysis that could be used to characterize that construct and measure it in that integrative way that you saw on the slide before. The rectangle here around circuits shows you that this is sort of the center of the matrix, and these are all the different ways of measuring a construct. And this is for a couple reasons. First of all, when we define these constructs, both in our own work and what the experts were told, there were 2 important criteria that had to be met in order to define a construct. First, you had to have empirical data that there was a validated functional construct involved, like fear behavior, sustained threat, frustrative non-reward, and so forth. Second, there had to be a neural circuit that you could reasonably specify that had a very large role in implementing the kind of behavior in that circuit. So if you go to our RDoC proceedings on our website, and the last slide in this talk will show you that website, you can see descriptions of these constructs and how the working group arrived at all of these, and you can see the circuits that they indicated. So then these other columns are the different ways that we can measure outputs of the circuits. Physiology is things like heart rate or cortisol. Behavior could include behavior on an actual test, like a test of working memory, or observing behavior, like a toddler assessment battery, where you watch a small child and those define behaviors. And self-reports can include both interviews that a clinician might conduct to get reports from the patient in that sense of self-report, but also interviews, scales and questionnaires that people fill out. And finally, the column here shows different paradigms because, of course, many of these things are measured in the laboratory with specific paradigms and are sometimes paradigm dependent. So it was important to list those as well. So this is an example of just one construct and what it looked like. As I mentioned, we asked the experts to fill in all the relevant information that will go to each of these units of analysis. This is the construct in the cognitive systems domain of cognitive or effortful control, a very important construct. You might also say impulse control. And this is one actual subconstruct the working group defined that you can see there. And they actually elaborated 2 different components of the circuit that you see here. And then it listed all of the different measures that might be used to assess these constructs. Now you can see some gaps where there's just no information there. And in part, one of the goals that we have is to actually promote research that would serve to fill in the matrix in these areas and to try to fill in the gaps in the matrix. And so this is sort of an example of what the outcome of the workshop was. And again, if you go to our website, you can read all of these and see all of the entries in all of the, for all of the constructs. So exactly what does RDoC involve? You've seen this chart, and what do we do with that? You know, it's sitting there, now what? Well, just so you have a clear understanding, RDoC is a research grant funding initiative. We are actually funding research grants to researchers who propose doing studies in line with these RDoC constructs and examining them as they cut across several different current disorders, and also people who don't necessarily have any diagnosable disorder at all, because of this idea of taking the full range of variation from normal range to abnormal functioning. And we fund research grants so that people can start playing with these constructs and seeing how they work, validate them further, figure out the best measures, and so forth. So it really is a research funding initiative. And again, it is research towards this new classification system. The idea is not that we think these are exactly correct. The idea is rather this is our first best thinking about this, but we need a lot of research to flesh these constructs out, to refine them, perhaps get new constructs, maybe delete some of our constructs or change how we think about them. And so we want to study and validate these dimensional constructs as they cut across our current disorders. Whoops. So the goal, as I said before, after funding a large number of studies, is to have a research literature that actually lines up with genetics, other areas of neuroscience and behavioral science, to give us the foundation that would tell us how we might actually go about doing more precise classification on the basis of these neural systems in the future. So just to be clear about what this involves, does anybody recognize this man? Yeah, I heard it. Say it louder. It's Frank Lloyd Wright, and what's the building? It's the Guggenheim Museum in New York, one of his most famous and last projects. Wright was famous for being obsessive in controlling every last aspect of his designs, right down to the carpeting and the furniture that would go in it. He had a fully completed project that he had conceived. This is not RDoC. The slide pointer is tricky. Maybe you can help me. It looks like the pointer is not wanting to. Can somebody advance? There. So this is RDoC. It's a framework for research. We're throwing up a framework and then inviting the field to submit research grants that will best finish the building, including maybe altering the design a little bit. And you can see that it is really hard work, and you can get an indication of that by the guy over here holding a whiskey bottle in his hand, even though he's 60 stories above the ground. So this is more how you should think about RDoC, and that we rely on all of you to submit the research grants and do the research, not only with us, but across the world, to really fill out this picture and get the information that we need to go forward. So let me give you an example of how this might look. We've talked about a little bit briefly about the classic Kraepelinian distinction between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And this is a study from a recent, some data from a recent large study that we funded called the BSNP project, looking at people who have a psychotic illness and can be diagnosed with gradations from full bipolar to full schizophrenia diagnosis. In other words, they created a schizobipolar score, and if you had a 0, you had a just classic pure bipolar phenotype. If you had a 9 in the scale, it was a pure textbook case of schizophrenia. But as you know, in the real world, most patients show a mix of symptoms, so this meant mostly bipolar with a little bit of stuff looking a little bit like schizophrenia. The middle would be probably what you'd get, actually a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, and then this gradates over here. So what you can see is that, in fact, there is no sharp break or disjunction as you'd expect from the Kraepelinian dichotomy. Rather, the average is exactly linear, and I should add, this is a cognitive functioning composite score, so this is composite functioning. So, what's impressive here, I think, is the tremendous amount of variability at each point along this range. And you can see the strong linear effect there. So this is our usual way of doing the research. We take people with pure bipolar, or maybe just a little bit of leakage towards schizophrenia, versus people with schizophrenia. We run the numbers, we get a significant difference between bipolar and schizophrenia, and we say patients with schizophrenia have worse cognitive function than patients with bipolar. And that's statistically significant. So we think that everybody with schizophrenia is worse than all the people with bipolar. And that's just clearly patently not true. And in fact, you could say, yeah, but you're really missing everything. You're missing this tremendous amount of variance at each level here, and you're missing the fact that this is a continuous function. And maybe what you really ought to worry about instead is to figure out why is it that in this space some people have relatively preserved cognitive functioning up here, no matter what their diagnosis is, even though all these patients would be worse than normal controls. Whereas other patients, no matter what their diagnosis, have really impoverished cognitive functioning, are severely impaired. And why is that? We need to look at the genes, the circuits, the environmental effects that promote this sort of difference, and that's where we're really going to understand how we can get at fixing impairments rather than saying treatments for schizophrenia, treatments for bipolar. And so this is, I think, a good example of what RDoC is about, and how what we would want to do is to select patients and controls on the basis of actual cognitive functioning at different levels, and actually in a specific area like working memory or declarative memory, rather than doing it in a DSM fashion. So you might wonder, well, if you do that, sort of where do the disorders go? People get nervous because the DSM disorders don't actually appear in the matrix. So this is just a little chart to show you that for just some of the different specific constructs and for the various domains, almost all of our disorders appear at most of the levels. And so that's, again, part of the problem that just shows you the heterogeneity and overlaps. But people who have these sorts of DSM problems are indeed represented in the RDoC matrix. We're just looking at it in a different way. So we are sometimes asked, but it's really hard. I have to report diagnosis in terms of ICD or DSM criteria, and we're used to thinking about patients that way. How do we even start doing RDoC experiments? One way that may be sort of a transition or a crosswalk is that rather than thinking about studying one disorder like schizophrenia, you might think about taking all of the patients who would fall in one whole chapter of the DSM-ICD metastructure. And if you haven't seen it yet, this is essentially the metastructure that will be used in common between the new DSM and new ICD revisions. So you might take people with any one of these disorders, and importantly, just as in the data that I just showed, you might take people who fall in either one of these two chapters, either schizophrenia spectrum or bipolar spectrum. Or you might study bipolar spectrum versus unipolar spectrum, or depression and anxiety, to look at those sorts of circuits. So that would be one way, and you might even, if you recruited a large enough sample, do one analysis in terms of some specific disorders, DSM disorders, but then look at it the other way and do an RDoC analysis across the dimensions to see how well that helps you understand your data and the experimental questions of interest. So I want to draw out some of the implications for prevention science. First of all, I haven't had a chance, this is just a very quick talk and I'm already short on time, but we really want to focus on developmental trajectories in RDoC. One of the things we think will help is that this system, we hope, will actually encourage researchers to look at development in these functions in a very specific way, and also to look more effectively at environmental effects. So really considering trajectories as people make the transitions from normal range behavior into abnormal behavior. And we think RDoC, because it's dimensional, will help us do that. And the second thing is that rather than simply looking at symptoms across those trajectories, we are trying to look at fundamental mechanisms and see, for instance, how does activation of HPA axis tend to exert plasticity in nucleus accumbens to depress reward-related sorts of behaviors, that sort of example. And third, I think, as that implies, when you look at constructs that span the full range of a dimension, that is, of a function, you can look at mild dysfunction and quantify that in a way that helps you understand the transitions to more serious pathology. And we know from data like Ron Kessler's that this happens. Patients with mild disorder at time 1, 10 years later, tend to show on the average more severe disorder. And finally, it gives you better outcome measures, because now one of the frustrating things about prevention is, for the most part, you're saying that a group that received a preventive intervention just has a lower proportion of disorders than a group that didn't get that prevention. It's sort of an awkward outcome because you're emphasizing the negative and it's purely binary. You either had the disorder or you didn't. But now you can actually look at quantifiable effects on these dimensions and to say, with a preventive intervention, people actually got better on a certain function or only got a little bit worse in a quantifiable way, as opposed to people who didn't have the intervention. So you don't have to deal with these rather simplistic outcomes like proportion of people with a disorder or percent of people with a disorder. And you also don't have to worry about all the possible comorbidities in the outcomes. One of the things we need 30 years into the future is a more reliable slide switcher. Okay. Okay, so I want to close with a mention of one of the ways that RDoC is already being implemented into clinical trials, and that's actually a little earlier than we had intended. As you have heard, pharmaceutical companies are rapidly withdrawing from drug development because they think that there simply aren't good targets for clinical research. And so they're going into other areas, and we're losing the participation of pharma in the development of new treatments. In no small part, this is due to the concerns that I outlined earlier that our DSM categories are so heterogeneous that they are very poor drug targets. So we are trying to help change the mindset in NIMH, and we have just issued a series of new contracts for very early clinical trials called Fast Fail, because the idea is to select a new compound and try to demonstrate that it actually engages a very specific functional target in the brain, that it engages reward-related circuits, fear circuits, or whatever, and that we can see that change just in terms of brain functioning and laboratory measures. If we don't see that, we'll say, okay, it just doesn't work. It was a nice idea, but it didn't work. Let's move on. When you do get a hit that it does seem to affect that circuit, then you can go on and start looking for symptoms. And so we've issued contracts in 3 related areas: autism spectrum, psychotic disorders, and mood and anxiety disorders. And you notice that in each case, we don't list a specific disorder. We have things like psychotic disorder, looking at that full, say, schizophrenia to bipolar spectrum, and the other disorders like schizophreniform, bipolar 2, and so forth. Mood anxiety would encompass all of our current mood and anxiety disorders. And importantly, what we encourage the researchers to do is not to look at our traditional symptom-based outcomes, but as I say, actually use RDoC constructs and the measurements that are available, which are not yet as many as we'd like, but there are still some good measures available in order to start looking at the target engagement data. And so this is a very new effort, but we think we've already had a lot of interest from pharmaceutical companies in coming back in and looking at this because, aha, now they can see that they actually might have some viable targets for research. So what does this project look like? Well, we think that at least to do this kind of validation research that I mentioned will take us 5 to 10 years or more. We want to examine, as I said, how these dimensions relate to our current disorder categories. An important component of this is, in fact, to develop and evaluate tests and methods that are suitable for measuring these dimensions. As I say, we have some few measures, but we need lots more, and so measurement development will be an important part of the RDoC project. And we've already started talking with our FDA about how you might get approvals for indications for drugs developed in terms of RDoC constructs, and they have been very forthcoming. We've had very positive discussions because the people at the FDA are also aware that we need to change, and they're interested in being part of this process. Again, it won't be easy, and they are using all due caution, but you know, there's an optimistic outlook for doing things in a new and different way. Okay, so in summary, I want to remind you that this is a translational approach, taking our data about normal range functioning and thinking about our disorders in terms of dysregulations in these normal behavioral functions and their neural circuits that implement those behaviors. And this reflects, I think, a real change in our perspectives in psychopathology. And I want to emphasize that this is not meant to be a fully completed system, but rather a new kind of framework to study mechanisms and circuits as they cut across our traditional disorders as we have understood them for so long. So what we hope for RDoC is not that it becomes a new system in itself, a competing system, but rather that RDoC will inform future editions of our diagnostic systems, say DSM-6 or DSM-7, ICD-13 perhaps. And that we do think that this reflects a way that we can work towards personalized medicine with respect to mental disorders, and in turn that will foster much more effective treatment development based on these mechanisms, not only for treating our disorders, but also for prevention. So thank you for your interest in this project, and I'd be happy to take any questions if we have time, Jair. let me just do one thing. The RDoc website is there. This is a very complex project, and I really haven't touched on many important aspects of the project. And maybe we can dim the lights for a moment up here on the stage again, because that website has links to all of the proceedings, links to or citations for published manuscripts. There's actually a very long description of the RDoc project itself right in the website. So I do encourage you to go to the website and take a look.
Thank you, Dr. Bruce, for the wonderful talk. We have now 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Professor Bruce, for your interesting lecture. I would like to ask about the place of epidemiological studies in this research project. Is there a place for epidemiological studies or only etiological?
I think eventually, but I think the epidemiological studies, that's a very good question. Traditionally in psychiatry, of course, our epidemiology is taking laptops and asking people about lots of symptoms and things. And I think we have to have a different approach. It will be something of a more medical approach. That is, we will need different kinds of measures than simply asking about symptoms. And that may well wait on technologies that can gather these kinds of information effectively and quickly. So, you know, you're not going to do an epidemiological fMRI study. But if you had really quick ways to assess different kinds of functions, maybe not even in a home, but in, you know, some of the epi studies use like a mobile trailer that goes around the country and people just come into the trailer, and there's, you know, like some of the health studies, they measure vision and hearing and grab blood pressure and some basic information like that. So once we actually translate complex measures that might be the gold standard now into more practical measures that you could deploy, I think that could be practical and a way to go at that. So I think that's how I would see that going. So I think it's very important, though. So, yes, Marna.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. It's the next step that I hadn't heard. But epidemiology, and I'm going to talk about translational epidemiology, is a way of generating hypotheses and also look at the whole spectrum. You mentioned Ron Kessler's work. And there is a role for epidemiology other than surveys. Surveys are just a very small part of epidemiology. And I think the best example is Eric Kandel's work, which was generated by Denise Kandel from her observations about which came first and what is the age when marijuana was introduced very young, that it led to cocaine, but when it was introduced later, it didn't, and he worked out the mechanisms using mice. So
yes, thank you.
I just felt I had to speak for epidemiology.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know Dr. Myrna Weissman, she's one of the world's leading epidemiologists at Columbia, and you'll have the pleasure of hearing her later in the week. I'm not sure when.
This will be the last, sorry.
All right. Thank you for this wonderful talk. I was wondering, do you see successful research with the RDoc, within the RDoc paradigm, with connecting at least 2 of the units of analysis, so for example, gene and molecules, or let's say circuits and self-report, or do you think that we're still at the 1-level analysis? And related to that also, is there more emphasis on some units than others in your own experience?
So thank you. Those are good questions. I'm glad you asked. Actually, you know, again, because of the short time, I didn't touch on lots of important things. Actually, we strongly emphasize using multiple measures that cut across those units of analysis and designs. If you only use one measure, you know, we would actually not be as enthusiastic about funding that at NIMH. You don't have to measure all of them. That would be impractical. But you want to make a good choice of, say, a behavioral measure, a circuit-based measure, and perhaps a genetic measure, and to indicate why those are the appropriate units that you would want. And so, you know, we actually very strongly encourage multiple units of analysis. We also encourage looking at 2 constructs at the same time, or even 3. So what are the effects of fear behavior on working memory, say, or stress on working memory? So we encourage looking at more than 1 construct at once. You don't have to stay with just 1. There are some constructs that are better worked out than others. For instance, there's a lot of interest in reward circuitry now and different tests and paradigms to measure different aspects of reward sensitivity, reward learning, responses to reward, and so forth. But we're really interested in all of these areas. For instance, in social processes, that's probably where things are least developed, but extremely important for autism, borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, many other of our current DSM notions of thinking. So, you know, we really encourage any of these areas. And we also encourage, you know, a lot of our funding announcements are only at these constructs, but the way we set it up is that, of course, because it's a research framework, we want to see people getting new constructs too. We need the new science to keep coming. So if someone says, I want to do a study that is looking at a new construct that we think is really important and we're trying to generate the data, we would be interested in that because it is a research framework. It's not supposed to be carved in stone. So the only way we can get that kind of change is to fund the research that will lead to that change. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Can we?
Oh,
We have a really important comment, so
Okay.
I'd like,
All
this
right.
is Dr. Joan Kaufman, from whom you'll also hear later. Joan?
Right. Well, thank you very much for this presentation. And I do have to say, I loved your photograph of the men at the work site because it really does highlight that we really don't know what this building is going to look like. And so I do just want to put on the table, we do have 2 projects that we're working on from an RDoC perspective. One is a study which kind of integrates looking at risk and resiliency in maltreated children who are at risk for ranges of different types of psychopathology, looking at, you know, negative valence, threat circuitry, among other circuits that are relevant, genes-environment interaction. But the other project that we're working on is a KSADS bridge, with the KSADS being the equivalent of the child's SCID. And the goal is to develop a computerized assessment that will be capable of generating DSM-5 diagnoses, dimensional scales of clinical symptoms, but also have computerized tasks that tap into the neural circuits that we're interested in the RDoC perspective. So looking at, you know, emotion processing, attention, and those other circuits, with the idea that we start to build the bridge and be able to, as we do assessments and studies, have measurements that are relevant really towards both systems. So it's all a work in progress.
So thank you. That's exactly the kind of work that we are hoping to see done. So we're very excited about that project.